Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are super pumped. This is months on end of in the making, so to speak. A lot of work has gone into this, and we're just very excited to, for the first time, bring forward a global cultural trends analysis to all of you. Most of you are our clients and our esteemed colleagues. I really appreciate you joining us today. My name is Ujwal. I'm an Executive Vice President and Group Director at Lux Research and the founder of MotivBase. I'm joined today by my other MotivBase founder, Jason Partridge, who's also Vice President of our Client Success and Delivery and Advisory team. Hey, Jason.
Hi, everybody. Really excited about the presentation today.
Before we get into it, I just want to give you a quick run of the show here. We've got a packed agenda. We're going to kick off by taking you through the research, which is in essence taking you through the 5 major shifts impacting consumer culture at a global stage in 2023. Followed by the presentations. The presentation will last about 40 to 45 minutes. Following that, we've got a panel discussion with 2 fantastic guests, Natalie Tacky, who is the Senior Innovation Manager at Kroger Company, and Elizabeth Oates, who's the Head of Consumer Insights at Ulta Beauty, will be joining us. They're on the line and will join us after the presentation for a 45-minute session to discuss the findings and talk about how they use the work and would consider the application of some of the findings into the work they do. So we're super excited to have them. I have seen both of them present before and have been part of, or lucky enough to be part of many conversations with them. So I know it will make for a fantastic conversation because both of them have incredible experience, really rich insights to bring through the lens of their work and also through the lens of how they see the future of our industry play out. Throughout this webinar, of course, you can type any questions that you have in the questions box on your screen, time permitting. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, especially as we go into our panel discussion. We will try to keep it as interactive as possible so that we can take your questions, integrate them into our conversations as well. In addition, if you have questions that do not get answered, you can also email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. Don't worry, a link will be provided in the chat box as well. Again, just super excited and super happy to have all of you here. With that said, let's jump right into it and get started. Jason, anything else I need to cover here?
Not at all. I'll be watching for questions as we go through, and we are good to start.
Perfect. All right. 5 key shifts shaping consumer expectation. First of all, before we get into this, I know most of you on the line are fairly familiar with what we do, or if you already work with us, you have a fairly deep knowledge of our methodology. But I'll do a super quick summary or overview just to give everybody a sense of exactly what goes into an analysis like this. First of all, we're an organization, a team of anthropologists, and in essence, we apply technology in order to do anthropological research. So what does that mean? Fundamentally, what we do is immersive ethnographic research, but we do that by studying the natural conversations that consumers are having on the internet in context. So in essence, our technology has 2 things: contextual intelligence, so understands how language shapes meaning in context. So how human beings link certain words with other words, giving meaning to those words, and in essence, building these systems of meanings and ideas, which is exactly how we are able to actually identify and predict the evolution of some of these shifts shaping consumer expectations. And I'll go into that in a second as well and just clarify that. The second thing is our engine also interprets the data model. So on one hand, it has contextual intelligence. On the other hand, it interprets the contextual data model in order to identify the human belief systems shaping consumer motivation or human motivation around these key shifts and ideas. So that's just a very quick recap of what we do. So fundamentally, we're a research technology that applies a deep anthropological model in order to study language in context and decode meaning in culture. This particular analysis was very unique, mainly because unlike a typical engagement where, let's say, a client might say, hey guys, go study, I don't know, the future of gut health. In this particular case, we don't have a subject matter really at hand. In fact, we're kind of having to reverse engineer and figure out or ask a sort of a big, hairy, audacious question, which is, what are the biggest issues shaping the future of culture over the next 12 months? In order to get there, we actually had to work our way backwards from what we call 70 different vectors. So in essence, what I mean by that is we identified 70 different areas that impact all of us as human beings consistently, as in all of us care about food, all of us care about health, all of us care about technology, all of us care about beauty and self-image. So we have 70 such vectors that we've identified over a decade of doing anthropological research. In essence, in order to identify these 5 shifts, we had to work our way backwards by examining consumer language and discourse across 13 countries, around 70 different vectors, and work our way backwards to identify what the most dominant shared themes were across these 70 vectors. In essence, what I'm trying to say is this is industry agnostic. We're truly trying to bring forward a cultural trend analysis. Yes, certain things may have some very obvious connections into certain categories of business, but fundamentally what we've done here is identified some core areas that apply to consumer needs and to consumer culture in an industry agnostic manner, giving us an opportunity to really look at these through the lens of strategy, innovation, business development, obviously, and of course, marketing and insights. So with that said, let's jump right into it. We're going to take you through 5 shifts. I'll begin with the very first one, from sustainability to resilience. This was a really interesting one. In essence, I mean, the notion of all of our interest in sustainability isn't new. All of us are aware of it. We all have mandates. Many of our organizations have made, have set goals for, 2030, 2040, 2050, what have you. What's interesting here is, and I think partly we have the pandemic to thank for that, partly war, who knows what's next, hopefully nothing, but, I think all of us would like to have a boring 2023 for a change. But I think what's interesting here is to see how sustainability has evolved into this conversation about resiliency. So what's the difference? Sustainability is about fixing problems in society as they arise. This is all the consumer perspective, by the way. This is not my opinion. Resiliency from the consumer's lens is about creating systems that will prepare society for disruption. You see how the difference in thinking is starting to take shape. We're going from fixing problems as they arise to creating systems that will prepare us for disruption. So sustainability is about how we, as consumers, as the human race, can meet our needs without compromising future generations, whereas resiliency from the consumer's perspective is, how do we prepare for threats? How do we absorb impact? How do we recover from inevitable disruption? And in particular, this shift from sustainability to resilience has or is shaping 2 sorts of expectations. One around this embrace of life cycle thinking. And there's a reason why the statement starts with corporations must. The consumer is putting the onus back on companies, back on organizations. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then the second area is about redefining what we think is success in our lives, mainly with the goal of avoiding collective burnout. And you're going to see a couple of these themes actually come up again and again in this session, which is, I think, quite fascinating to see. And it's shaping some new expectations. So let's dive right into these. The other thing I should pinpoint is you're seeing 3 flags in countries in focus. The analysis came from 13 different countries. What we're doing in each shift is highlighting some key countries that are either leading the way or countries where there's some amount of disruption happening, just to illustrate the point. So let's dive into the first area of sort of new expectations, this whole idea of embracing life cycle thinking. What is this about? This is really about going beyond a traditional focus on production manufacturing to include environmental, social, economic impact of a product from inception to elimination. And what the consumer is trying to tell us here is that we need to embrace systems that make these types of, let's say, fully circular solutions more accessible to all, right? So that's one way in which the consumer is articulating this and bringing this to life. In essence, it's inception to elimination. And you'll notice here that on one hand, you've got a country, and it's a good contrast, like Germany, that is way, way advanced in the established idea stage of maturity. On the other hand, you've got the United States that is experiencing a fair bit of growth, but it's still in the early consensus stage in terms of this particular shift. And by the way, just a quick note on maturity. We are measuring consensus of meaning, not the mentions of these topics. So what's the difference? I throw a random sample of 100 people in a room. I ask them, hey, what does this idea of life cycle thinking mean to you? 18 of those 100 are giving me the same answer. Maturity is 18%. Why is that important to measure? Because for something to become mainstream, at least 33 out of 100 people must answer in the same way, must have the same meaning around an idea. So when consensus of meaning is achieved, something becomes mainstream. Again, there'll be links at the end of the presentation if you'd like to dig more into our maturity calculation and understand it better as well. So in particular, there are some key action areas that are developing here. Shifting our responsibility towards the circular economy. This is really about making circular solutions more accessible. Consumers right now believe that circular solutions are not accessible to all. They're not accessible to the middle class, to the lower income groups. They believe it's something for the wealthy. Whether that's technically true or not, that is a perception that has to be addressed. Increasingly, ethical is becoming equated to quality. This is very interesting, right? Because what the consumer is telling us is quality isn't just about technically higher quality product. It's also about the product having certain qualities, right? Certain qualities, as in certain qualities that come from an ethical way to manufacture, distribute, and dispose off of the product. It's about honesty and transparency and a dedication to life cycle thinking. So the more ethical the product, it's assumed to be of better quality. And then lastly, another action area is waking up to the impact of end-of-life waste. It seems like the consumer's suddenly woken up and realized things like, so for example, biodegradables. Consumers saying, oh, hang on, don't biodegradables leave some kind of sort of residue behind? Shouldn't we prefer organics on the other hand? So it's those kinds of questions that are being asked, and it's a result really of consumers getting very, very worried about being greenwashed. And of course, there's some obvious product examples that exist in our culture already, but where the gap is bringing strategic cohesive thinking into the work we all do. So it's not that, I'm sure many of you are already embracing this sort of thinking, are already starting to bring solutions like these to bear, to market. And I think the point of showcasing this is to help us see cohesively, what does this look like? What are the other pieces? Are there other opportunities within these spaces that we're potentially missing or not pursuing? Are there certain markets that we're potentially under delivering on and so on?
And I think it's just before we move off of this, I think that I just want to draw attention really quickly to this idea of waking up that appeared in that kind of that last section, because if we think where we started with this whole idea of moving from sustainability to resilience, there's something taking place here. It's almost kind of like an existential awakening for a large part of the global population that went from this notion or this idea that the role of sustainability is me as an individual's kind of requirement, and something that I'm being, the finger is pointed directly at me. Am I recycling enough? Am I finding the right products? Am I doing the right thing? And what's happening now with this whole notion of this idea of realization that there is a process that takes place from the kind of the inception to the elimination of products, where there are things that I as an individual can't do as a consumer, and therefore I need to figure out different ways in order to have impact by choosing to make the right decision in what I buy. And that's why they're looking to corporations to say, how are you going to help me make the right decision? How are you making the right decision so that I can better choose which products I'm going to look for? I'm going to start, there's so much information, I'm going to filter out certain solutions. And if they're more ethical, I'm going to assume that they're not just better for people in general, but are likely better from a durability standpoint, are going to last longer, all the way down to, I want to understand when I'm done with this, where does it go and what happens to it? This is a very, very big shift that I think is quite interesting. And it really is kind of an awakening where consumers are starting to say, look, there's only so much I can do. We need to either work together to come up with solutions, or the people that are basically earning money as a result of my choices need to help me make better decisions. And you'll start to see that theme kind of come to life as we start to look at collective burnout as well.
Yeah, and collective burnout. So again, we're still, talking about this whole shift, right, from sustainability to resiliency. So within that context, another area that's really impacting consumer mindset here is this idea of avoiding collective burnout. And it's really because consumers are starting to feel like everything is creating sort of a sense of anxiety, right? A lot of these problems are starting to feel like they're too big to solve. And so consumers are gravitating toward solution systems, philosophies that make them feel like even the small minutia decisions can help them make an impact. That's in essence what collective burnout is starting to teach us. And here are two countries to call out. The US is actually much more advanced in this area with the desire for little moments of action. Mexico is following quite closely with quite immense growth coming in early consensus, still not yet fully in mainstream acceptance stage, but getting there. And again, within this space, there are two key action areas emerging. One is this notion of helping yourself because no one else will help you. And it sounds, sounds sort of sad to say, but the reality is that people are starting to believe that in order to thrive, I don't have a system around me that will support me and help me thrive. That's gone. That feeling is just gone at a global level. So what does that do for the consumer? It makes them realize that in order to thrive, I need to teach myself how to grow personally. I need to take the steps I need to take in order to protect my own health, my own sense of well-being. This is why we're seeing so much happening in the entire self-care, wellness landscape. It's not going away because of this fundamental shift. And relatedly, it's also redefining people's expectations around luxury with, people saying, I'm tired of feeling anxious or tired of feeling, like I'm not doing enough. Sort of the whole Instagram illusion is finally over, right? People are realizing their Instagram posts of my friends don't actually reflect the reality of how happy they are. So I got to focus inward on the things that make me happy. Staycations, home pamperings, strategies to cope and bring joy in the day-to-day. This is the kind of stuff that is really driving an interest in the small things I can do, the small dollars and euros and pesos, whatever I can spend in order to drive the change. Okay. Let's jump on to shift number 2. And there are a whole bunch of questions coming in, and we'll address them as we go along, or perhaps towards the end as well here. So the first shift we talked about is sustainability and resilience. Now we're going to talk about the second one, from following rules to following instinct. Following rules has been a big part of a lot of our lives, but in particular, the pandemic really made this severe, right? We had a new set of rules, and many of them still carry forward as softer rules, as social rules, but we had a new set of rules. And what that's done is it's kind of hit the reset button for a lot of consumers who are trying to make the shift from doing things the way they've always been done to trying to rebalance their life to feel more fulfilled. And COVID has really had a big impact in this. And so what does the shift really mean? What does it mean to follow my instinct? It means reimagining how to live my life, how to gravitate towards solutions that will make my life naturally feel more balanced. Those of you who are in the food industry might naturally think about intuitive eating or intuitive food habits. Yes, that's a part of this, but this is much bigger than that. And in particular, there are two ideas shaping consumer expectations. One is this notion of health and happiness being intrinsically linked to a happy world. Obviously, we're starting to realize that our health and happiness cannot come at the price of the environment or the earth. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then second area is health and happiness intrinsically linked to our bodies. And obviously, big realization, the big shift here coming towards this idea of saying, hey, a strict adherence to something can actually be harmful, let alone perhaps, not doing good, it can actually be harmful. In addition to that, there's this whole mortality awakening as well that we'll get into, but a lot of shifts happening here, ultimately shaping, the consumer sort of idea here of wanting to kind of move away from rules to instincts. So the first one, tying my health and happiness to a healthy world. This is an example, again, where the US actually is in mainstream acceptance stage. But on the other hand, you've got a country like Japan that's further along with sort of a natural momentum that's stronger and more mature than the United States. Again, the focus really being not just on mind and body, but mind, body, and earth. And then specifically what that means is, hey, it's not enough to be just kind to yourself. You also have to be kind to the world around you. I think the outcome of that is quite self-explanatory, but ultimately ethical self-care is the change, right? Self-care to ethical self-care. And how do we define ethics? We define ethics by saying, is this detrimental to the world around me? The next area is this notion of purity. This is very interesting because consumers are, along with the whole greenwashing issue, consumers are starting to become very wary of ingredients and how ingredients are marketed to them. And as a result of that, they're starting to come up with little hacks, easy ways to feel like if I consume certain types of ingredients, products with certain types of ingredients that are naturally pure, then I'm going to feel more natural. I'm going to feel more alive. And it's going to be simpler. It'll more likely do the job I'm hiring it to do. So this is very interesting. So what does that mean? It means exactly what you think. People are gravitating towards ingredients that naturally feel like they're connected to nature. It's more easy for people to imagine these ingredients. And of course, this movement has been long coming in the food space, but it's not just food. It's transferring into all kinds of other industries now with this desire for so-called purity. Again, it's not about the ingredient itself. It's about how it makes the consumer feel, makes them feel more alive, makes them feel more natural. And then lastly, this whole notion of dipping back into my cultural history, my cultural roots. This is very interesting. I think there's, on one hand, obviously, socially in our world, there's much greater acceptance of the history that we all bring to bear, right? Depending on where we grow up, our immigrant story, whatever that might be. On one hand, we're all more open to having that discussion, especially, I would say, in the last couple of years. But on the other hand, I think that openness has also made us dip back into our own rich cultural histories and look into practices, ancestral practices, practices that have come from generations of knowledge, where simple things were done in really effective ways. And there's definitely, sort of a revisit of that. And again, the goal here is to reduce how synthetic and inauthentic our world is feeling right now. That's the goal here. Why am I doing that? Because I'm starting to feel like my world is becoming a bit too synthetic.
And overcomplicated, which I think is a really, really interesting underlying theme that we're seeing go across the board here, right? On one hand, you've got this notion of, I understand the connection between mind and body, but I'm increasingly becoming aware of how the outside environment, how the choices that I'm making are impacting myself, but in turn are impacting other people, impacting the world around me. And there's this impending kind of tidal wave that is building, where if I make bad choices for what's happening in the world around me, that's going to come back to make my life more difficult in the future. So how do I start to basically make little kind of incremental changes to my life? I look for purity as being a proxy for choices that I need to make moving forward. And I look back to things that have worked from a traditional or cultural standpoint for my parents, for people that I know through history, through what I've experienced in life. And I use these ways in order to filter out and start to prioritize some of the choices that I'm making. Because at the end of the day, I'm intrinsically understanding that my health and happiness is more and more being linked to the world around me. And that will continue to be something that we'll see to grow over the next 12 months.
Exactly. And then relatedly, health and happiness also linked to my body. We all know the adage of mind over body, but this is being re-examined. into the narrative of instinctually listening to my body, trying to understand what my physical feelings and sensations are trying to tell me. There's a distinction there, right? Mind over body says, put up with it. Whereas instinctually listening to your body says you don't have to put up with it. So there's a difference there. And again, both the US and France are in focus here, both in mainstream acceptance stage. Obviously, a lot of nice movement coming here in terms of creating urgency around having our foot in the door in some of these spaces. And again, in terms of key action areas, a couple of them that really should be called out. Mindful permission is probably the more obvious one. It's okay to give myself permission for an indulgence. And I'm not just talking about food, any kind of indulgence. I don't have to constantly make myself feel guilty for indulging. I think that's a big one. I think that's probably more obvious. The other two are very interesting. On one hand, you've got this whole idea that adherence can actually be harmful. Again, you can blame the pandemic on this because now the consumer is starting to come to this realization that, hey, if I go a little too rigid, so let's say I'm trying to lose some weight and I'm a little too rigid, it's actually going to be harmful. I might lose the weight, but it might harm my mental health, my sense of well-being, my sense of self. That's the idea there, that strict adherence can actually create a negative impact on our habits, our practices, our sense of self. So people are trying to find the healthiest habits. Very interesting. We've seen a lot of this movement, but again, all of this is getting connected into the underlying shift, as I mentioned, about living more intuitively. And then lastly, the mortality awakening. This one's quite interesting. I think, again, the war doesn't help, but consumers really trying to embrace a more simpler life, trying to avoid excess. There's this realization that excess actually disrupts harmony in our lives. Our obsession with excess disrupts harmony. In essence, the consumer is saying we all have to take a chill pill. And it's very interesting how that's starting to play out. And again, you'll also see some linkages, right? In the previous shift, we were talking about how people were trying to find little moments of luxury. And then here you're seeing people are saying, hey, our obsession with excess is actually creating more harm than good. Jay, how are we doing for time?
Great. Stay the course.
I think we're good, right? Jump into shift 3. Yep. Automated curation to curation validation. This is a very interesting one. I mean, automated curation obviously has been a long time coming. We all use technologies to order stuff online. I mean, if any of you don't, power to you. I don't know how you manage to live life without it, but certainly I can't. And in that world now, suddenly there's new realizations, new developments. And what is the shift? The shift is, for the longest time, we were so obsessed with having easy access to information, easy access to everything. Now I want agency so I can understand the information. There's a difference there. And I'll explain this difference a little bit more. But the key takeaway is we're going from ease to having agency, and then being able to leverage the ease when we feel we should leverage the ease. And there's a difference. And the difference really plays out when you look at how the two spaces start to map out in terms of changing expectations. Validated curation is really about the consumer saying, I still want the social capital from having access to interesting things. I still want to accumulate the symbolic capital currency that my friends are accumulating by the things they acquire and engage with and so on in my social circles. But what's even better, what will give me even more capital, is if I can demonstrate that I chose those things. I didn't just succumb to the algorithms, so to speak. Again, I'm embellishing a little bit here, but that's in essence what we're seeing. And the result of it is, a new expectation about unconveniencing curation, right? And the consumer saying, for the longest time, we just wanted convenient everything, especially when it came to curated products and solutions. Now we're trying to unconvenience our own curation process. And there's two reasons for that. So let's dive right into that. The first thing to keep in mind in terms of this whole narrative is people just don't want to feel like passive recipients, right? Ultimately, that's why they want a sense of agency. They want to feel like They're playing a role in validating whether these choices that are being recommended to me are actually the right choices. Again, two countries in focus here, China and the US. You'll see the US is consistent, but mainly because we wanted to show a contrast in how other countries pan out versus the US here. But again, both in mainstream acceptance, China, in fact, even further along in this notion of inconvenience and curation. And really two action areas that are developing here. One is this notion that trust is built by empowering personal discovery. So trust is not built by just telling me what I should buy next. It's built by empowering personal discovery. And there's a big difference there. And the big difference ultimately is that I, as a consumer, want to understand why I'm being given certain recommendations. I want to know why. I want to know, hey, you bought that. I'd recommend this to you. And it's because I notice you're really interested in these types of products. And I might go, oh, actually, yes, I am interested. And that's okay for me. But when I don't know, it makes me feel like I'm in the dark. And that feeling of agency is what is being craved here. The other one is people are worried that by blindly following curation, they're exposing themselves to a very narrow worldview. And they're kind of speaking to other people who are just like them. They're not getting plurality of ideas. And this is not about politics, even though it makes it sound like it. This is literally about the types of products and solutions we engage with in our culture and society. That itself creates plurality of thought and idea because you get exposed to different stuff around you. So it just shows us how the role we play is potentially starting to change around this space as well.
So just one point to add on that, Age, before we move on, is that I think that there's two things that I just want to drive home. The first and foremost is that when we think about serving up information to people, it's so inherently built into our system to basically drive ease and convenience as being the kind of the key drivers. And what this shift is telling us is that ease and convenience is not enough. It needs to allow for that personal discovery, and the solutions that will win, the kind of the support, the curation that will win will be the one that basically empowers that sense of discovery, that includes the worldview, but that the user walks away feeling like it has made them better. If it does not have that ability to make it, it's not about more, and it's not about just making it simple. It's about that notion of them feeling part of the process. I love the image of a circle that is almost kind of drawn, but has that little bit that is just left open for the consumer to feel like they're playing that role in filling in that last little bit of the gap, because that's what builds trust in the information, because they feel like they validated it. And secondly, it emotionally rewards them for having gone through the process of engaging with the information. And I think that that will be very, very important moving forward. And you'll see that come to life in the examples of the products that are listed in this report when you review it later.
Thanks, Jason. All right, shift number 4. This is going to sound like we know this. Oh yeah, from budget to aligning with values. Again, there's a nuance here, excuse me, that is really shaping the future of this landscape, especially in the next 12 to 24 months. And the nuance is fitting a budget was really about, again, about ease and convenience, as Jay was just talking about. Aligning with values is not just about aligning with values in terms of, social values and environmental values. It's about aligning with values, again, it's about understanding why something is so easy to buy. It's the consumer literally saying, help me understand, why is this product so easily available and so much cheaper than that product? Why is that the case? People want answers to these types of questions, and it's very difficult for them to understand this. Those of us who work in the industry may think, oh, that's kind of obvious. From the consumer's perspective, it's not. And those are the questions they're starting to ask. Because aligning with values is not just about smart marketing. It's about helping consumers understand how they can figure out whether the product is right for me. And they're starting to ask questions like questions about the supply chain, questions about how something is made. They're starting to go into details. And this is why the big expectation, the shift, is about this idea of consumer-led authentication. And I want to explain this a little more. And again, the two countries in focus here are China and the US in particular. Because on one hand, there's this concern about what is truly sustainable. And then on the other hand, there's this concern about digital authentication. And really, consumer-led or community-led validation is really what it's coming down to. Again, this is another theme that you'll see pervasive through this analysis, is we started with this notion of greenwashing. Then we went to this notion of worry over the types of ingredients we're getting. And now we're seeing this notion of validating the claims that organizations are making. So clearly, trust is broken. I mean, again, this is not news to any of you, at least I hope not. But I think, all of us in the past have certainly looked at this through the lens of, we got to build trust. We got to build trust with the T word by being transparent. And I think what we're trying to identify here is transparency is not so simple. It's not as easy as just saying, here's some details about the product. We have to shape through the way the consumer thinks. I think that's the challenge we're trying to help solve here, which is if the consumer thinks through the lens of community-led authentication and validation, that's how we have to deliver the information to them. So consumers want to work collaboratively with organizations. They want to anticipate advancements in the hopes that these things will make their own lives easier. It'll validate their own decisions, make them feel better. One thing to note here, though, is unlike the first three shifts that we talked about, this is the first shift where you'll see no prediction. And the reason is the shift is volatile, i.e., and I'll go into this, by the way, at the end of the presentation, because I know there were a couple of questions on this. We actually predict the evolution of a shift by examining how the patterns of language use are evolving. So if you remember, I said maturity is about consensus of meaning. Consensus of meaning is measured by looking at how the patterns of language converge with time. So a really mature idea has less diversity in language use. We all agree on what it means. Immature idea has deep diversity. None of us agree on what the idea means, and we all use different language. And the way we predict is by looking at going 4 years back and looking at the patterns with which language is converging or not. Is it becoming less diverse with time? In both these cases, stuck in early consensus. Yet its importance. Why is it important? Because it's still an important shift, but it's one of those things where the urgency is not tomorrow. So what are the action areas coming out of this whole notion of consumer-led authentication? I talked a little bit about the sourcing, what is truly a sustainably made product. I think this is a big concern for people. One of the things that has been a proxy in the past is novelty around sustainability. When people see novelty, they're more interested in the product. Now what the consumer is interested in is novelty applied to making something more sustainable. So what I mean by that is consumers want to see the innovation in a process, in a methodology. They want to see the innovation in how something is built, made, distributed, and that innovation should be a direct result of the desire to make something more sustainable. So that's really the desire there. And then the whole idea of digital authentication is interesting. Obviously, the consumer's knowledge of blockchain and all these developments around digital ID and authentication is still new. It's still growing. People are jumping on the bandwagon of NFTs and all this other stuff. But the reality is actually the concern is quite deep. Consumers are realizing, hey, turns out, is it possible that I can also be frauded very easily through these methods? So part of this also is the concern over just fraud as a result of some of these new technologies and what might need to be done in order to avoid that and help consumers navigate that. All right, shift number 5, from social polarization to social elevation. I think this was probably one of my favorite ones. And the reason it was one of my favorite ones was because it shows us, in a way, it also kind of brings together a lot of what has been going on in terms of our personal relationships and our lives as human beings. We went through this period where we just retreated to comfortable relationships, especially during COVID. And now coming out of that, there's this deep desire for social elevation, this desire for exploring a spectrum of relationships, because we also want to be exposed to newer ideas and newer thought. I know day to day, many of us might not feel like that, especially those of us that live in countries that have seen the advancement of populist movements and change of the political guard and all of that, sometimes we feel like actually the world is getting more fragmented. But the reality is that's not the case. There's actually a deep human desire for diversity of opinion, of thought. We're seeing this pervasive, right? We talked earlier about consumers saying, hey, don't just curate products for me. I want more diversity of ideas. Here we're saying, I want more diversity of relationships, and I want that spectrum to be wider. And what does that specifically mean? People are becoming more open to realizing that they can expose themselves to different types of relationships, but in a well-rounded manner. And I want to explain that. This is, I think, key. What's happened is, in the past, especially with the social media world, we've gone through a scenario where we've struggled to make sense of certain types of online relationships. We have seen the impact this has had on our mental health, on our sense of well-being, especially the younger generations. And I think now there's this greater realization that coming out of the pandemic, that we have to explore relationships through the lens of what they are. We have to set expectations for those relationships through the lens of what they are. And parasocial relationships are a classic example of that. And I want to dig into that because it has great impact for many of our brands that employ influence and influencer marketing, and employ, obviously most of us use advertising for consumer first and so on and so forth. So what does that really mean from social polarization to social elevation? First of all, both really critical topics, two countries in focus. I mean, this is a critical topic the world over, but again, we wanted to bring China and the US as two contrasting countries of focus, both in which massive growth, and growth that lands these cultures into the mainstream acceptance zone. The second thing I wanted to highlight was, and I'll start with parasocial relationships, very interesting. Take the classic example of the one-way relationship that I as a consumer might have with an influencer that I follow. Let's say I'm really into fashion. I follow this blogger on Instagram and get their ideas. From time to time, I try to engage with them, never hear back. It has an impact on your health, your sense of well-being. Now there's this new realization that if we better define what these relationships are, we set different expectations for different relationships. And as a result, we can actually extract the maximum out of them. So classic example here is this realization that, if it's a parasocial relationship, I would much rather have a relationship that feels more cathartic. It provides a safe space for me to deal with difficult emotions, trauma that I'm hearing about. I'm not necessarily communicating back. And if I am, I'm not communicating back because I want a one-to-one response. I'm communicating back because I'm just sending something into the void, if you will, and that's okay. I'm comfortable with that idea. So this idea that as a human being, I'm going to have 3 different types of relationships or 4 different types of relationships. I'm going to have my physical in-person relationships. I'm going to have my digital relationships. I'm going to have my phygital relationships. And I'm going to have these parasocial relationships, and they all have different expectations. That's becoming more of a reality. And I think that has a big impact in terms of how we think about building customer experiences that really impact organizations and consumers in the right way. And then accessibility. I think this is really interesting because consumers actually are realizing, or at least believe, that a phygital relationship, a combination of digital and physical, is actually critical. There's an increasing reality that we don't want a relationship that is solely single source, that is solely digital, as an example, because it's not accessible. And what's even more interesting perhaps to me here is, even if I am somebody that does not need an accessible solution, I'm more likely to support and want to go and buy solutions and engage in an experience that is accessible, because that's my way. Again, going back full circle here, that's my way to have my every little dollar that comes out of my wallet make an impact on the world around me. So I think this is really what really hit home for us throughout these 5 key shifts, in terms of just realizing how significant a lot of this was and what it was teaching us in terms of realizing where the world is headed and what kind of impact that might have in terms of changing consumer expectations. At this point, I'd like to invite our 2 esteemed guests, Natalie and Elizabeth, to join us as well. And then Jay, we can probably take some questions as well and kind of make it part of our discussions, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. There's a couple of questions that are in the chat that I do want to kind of make sure that we think about as we go through our discussion, but I think I'll find a way to bring them up kind of organically as we kind of go through the process.
Perfect. Awesome. First of all, Elizabeth, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. I think, it feels, we talked about cathartic relationships. It kind of feels cathartic to us, having gone through 5 months of this process of trying to bring this research together, and to have brilliant minds like you to actually talk about it and get your thoughts on it. I thought just to get us warmed up, perhaps I would begin by just asking each of you if there was one area in particular that really struck you in terms of either the way you think about the industry or the work that you're currently doing. Perhaps we can begin with you, Elizabeth.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me today. I'm just excited to be looking forward at what's going to be happening in 2023 and helping myself and my business, and like all of us on the call, helping all of our businesses prepare for the future. So to answer your question, though, I think the one area that really stood out to me, everything was incredible, and I'm taking lots of notes all along the way. The one area that really stood out for me, though, was this idea of redefining success to avoid this collective burnout. And I think that's really important for how we think about the industry that I'm in beauty. Is because from a cultural standpoint, in the from to, we're going from a world where busyness was a sign of success, into a world where we're seeing personal wellness as a sign of success. So we're kind of saying, hey, it's okay to take care of ourselves first, and it's okay. And not only is it okay, it's a sign of success. So I was really leaning into that idea of avoiding collective burnout.
That's very interesting. And we'll definitely circle back to that as well, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Natalie?
Yeah, I can build off that, actually. I kept thinking about how often you said the word why. And what it made me think of is, A, consumers are starting to sound a lot like innovation managers. Yeah. It's asking probing questions, trying to get at those underlying things that are causing us to feel the way we feel or act the way we act. Preparing for possible futures, just that level of desire to understand. It made me think a lot about, and maybe this is obvious, but the pandemic sort of stripped everyone globally back down to that bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, where it was just about feeling safe, right? And I think because of that, consumers are questioning everything that they've believed before. And they're asking, why am I eating the foods I'm eating? Why am I buying the products I'm buying? Why am I spending the money I'm spending? And it's almost this, the flip side of burnout, right? It's this excitement of saying, maybe I can self-actualize into something that feels really real for me and really good. Related to this too, I personally am someone who hates made up rules, red tape. Like, I know it is one of my pet peeves. So I love that consumers are starting to realize that some of the rules as societies we live in are made up. Yep. And can I really start to question those rules and instead say, what is my instinct really telling me? Like, I want to break some of these established and made up rules to just be an actual happier, better person.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we were actually quite surprised by how much questioning was happening around all of this. And I think, we've all been sort of seeing signs and symbols of this in the different industries that we work in and different shifts that we're all experiencing in the work we do. But seeing it come together like this was really interesting to us. This sort of relates to both the points you made, both of you made. Just coming back to this idea of collective burnout. One thing that struck me, and perhaps Elizabeth, I'm curious about your thoughts on this. on one hand, it's kind of a, for the lack of a better way to put it, a sad reality to say, hey, I can't really rely on the system around me. It's not going to protect me, my sense of well-being, my sense of happiness. So I'm just going to have to get better at investing in myself. And I'm just curious, just to hear your thoughts on that, and how much of this you guys also see in the work you do, and I guess how you see the positive side of that outcome.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you don't mind, I'm going to flip the script on how you stated that too. So going from the from to there, no one's going to do it for me. To now I'm empowered to do this myself. Mm-hmm. I don't have to rely on anyone else. And I think we're starting to see that come through in all sorts of different ways and paths. And, so it's a lean in. I can get my own wellness, like whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, whichever type of wellness is most important to me. I have the power to do that. And, even all the way through into, I have agency to make my own choices and to find the information that I need to make the right choices. So, I think it's an evolution of the power that consumers have, and they have been empowered more and more over the past few years. But now that we're sort of realizing that power is in our hands, which means that as an organization and a retailer, we need to be enabling of that power and, and providing that power, but providing information as well and inspiration for consumers, and to give them the agency, because they really are empowered to take it on themselves. And we want to also, I think from a society also say, yeah, we can do it. We should support each other. There is a community that consumers are creating about feeling well and wellness, but everyone, like I said, is empowered to take it on their own. So I feel like there is some good that's happening.
Let me play the devil's advocate to this. At the same time, I'm so nervous about where they're getting their information. And it gets to that curation piece, especially in my experience in the food and beverage industry. Consumers are almost always wrong.
Yeah.
When you really think about the science behind what's in a food or a beverage and what they believe. And it doesn't matter that they're wrong, because what they believe is the only thing that matters and how it makes them feel, right? Yeah. So where are they going to get this information from? What are they going to get wrong? How do we make sure consumers are making those wellness choices with information that's real and accurate? Like how do we make sure they're putting their trust in the right organizations, brands, et cetera? It part of that also just makes me so nervous about what project I'm going to get handed next that I know is complete crap, but I have to do anyway, because that's where the dollars are being spent, right? It makes me nervous.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Natalie, because I think, and it kind of connects to one of the other areas we saw with, this whole focus on curation. I think, the positive side of that is that consumers are starting to, I think a lot of consumers are starting to realize that a lot of what they have been led to believe because of whatever was, trending wherever and came across their feeds or what have you, may not necessarily actually be right and do what it's supposed to do for them. And I think, part of that really struck me was people, consumers saying, I don't want somebody else to curate something for me. Just give me the information, or at least tell me why this is the case. But, I think the point you're making, Natalie, is it's a fine line between the marketing message that delivers the interest and the technology that actually solves the problem, if you will.
I also think that at a higher order, if we look and we take a step back and we look at all of the shifts, there is a burden that is sitting across the board on consumers where there is so much information, there's so much that they have to deal with, there's so much pressure, there's anxiety in regards to what the future looks like, that they're trying to create filters for themselves in order to survive. Some of those filters are trying to basically figure out, how do I access the right rational information that I can believe in, that I can trust? Some of those situations are, I can't find rational information, so I'm looking for cultural touchstones in order to guide my choices, because if it worked for my parents, then maybe it'll work for me, all the way down to using instinct to basically say, this feels like the right thing, so I'm going to listen to my body, and it's okay that I'm going to eat this Mars bar after I go to the gym, because at the end of the day, my body really deserves it, right? Like it's this combination of kind of, it's a juggling exercise that people are going through as we look at how they're navigating life. And if we don't understand the emotional journey that they're going on, the rational journey that they're going on, and the functional requirements that they have in their day-to-day life, then we don't have a full picture of how to serve these people.
I do think we have to give consumers some credit too. They're trying. And, you know, as we were looking at the clean beauty industry, so beauty is going through an evolution similar to what food and beverage did probably a decade ago, about consumers asking for clean. You know, and we were out, my team was asked to say, okay, how are we going to approach this as Ulta Beauty? And we went out and did some really extensive research, both qualitative, you know, in-depth ethnography, as well as massive quantitative, you know, nationwide, coast-to-coast study. And we came up with we found one really important stat, that was 75% of consumers want clean ingredients. And we're like, oh, well, it seems so obvious, right? Like, okay, let's just go do it. But before we did, we kind of paused and said, why is that important? And going back into all of the research, we found that consumers were actually, you know, it was kind of coming out as this one statistic, but really there was two levels and two layers underneath that desire for clean. And one was this really rational choice of, you know, I want clean, and because I want to know what's in the ingredients, I'm putting it on my skin, I'm putting it in my body in some cases, and I want to make sure that it's clean, it's natural, it's cruelty-free. And it was kind of leading to this idea of transparency that we've talked about, you know, all day today. But also on the other side, there was this emotional standpoint. I think it was also kind of woven through the conversation today, that was really about, I want to make a choice that's good for me and good for the world around me. And so there was a need for both sustainable products and having a social impact when I'm buying. And so that one statistic that was really about clean actually led us into more of an entire conscious beauty approach that we take now today, which I think is reflective of this really complicated, complex, but also thoughtful and meaningful approach that consumers are taking to getting information and making choices.
I think that's an amazing point, Elizabeth, because you know, we've seen it far too many times where I'll use the exact example you used, right? Where we take a statistic like that and we think that's what we need to do. It's about clean beauty. And to, you know, Natalie's earlier point, we don't take the time to ask, what is this a manifestation of? Because all these things are manifestations of something else that's actually happening. And as human beings, we don't have the ability to figure all of this out and explain that to somebody. Even in our personal relationships, we don't have that ability to do that. That's why we have the therapist's couch. And even there we struggle. So I think that's the interesting thing, is that is tapping into the three layers of why, getting to what is really going on. And I think there was another thing you said that I would also, you know, love both your thoughts on this, which is you use the word, or maybe I'm paraphrasing, the word complex, right? A lot of consumers have fairly complex ideas of what they're trying to do. Yep. And they themselves don't have clarity on that. And I think our job in those moments becomes to try to give them a little bit of clarity in those moments. And I'm also just curious to hear from you, from both of you, on how to deal with these types of situations, right? Where you see insights that are fairly complex. There's layers of information and layers of why driving a particular manifestation. How do you deal with that, and how do you make the organization more comfortable with that complexity?
I can start and just say, I think working for any big company that's dealing with consumers as their end customer, you have some people in leadership that have been in these organizations a long time and were there when one size fits all solutions worked. And there's definitely this evolution where, it's in every industry. That's just not the customer anymore. We cannot generalize anymore. Like Elizabeth said, like you can't take anything at surface level. You've got to figure out what those microcultures are, what those breakdowns are, a level below that, and have smaller product, definitions of success for an individual product and a broader assortment that's going to meet those individual needs. And this might be really difficult for some brands. I think it's easier for somebody like Kroger because we already have to have something for everybody. And we've got our own brands, which is what I work on, but we've also got national brands, so there's a lot of room but on the shelf for that. But for some brands that are really rooted in the way they've always been, their group of customers might start to get smaller and smaller and smaller. As those microcultures emerge. As simple as it is too, one of my concerns is just real estate on the label. Like, how do you make sure the right person picks up that product is really difficult. And I'm really looking forward to this more phygital world where the customer's just going to be walking around in their augmented reality glasses in a Kroger, and they're going to be getting fed all this information in real time about like where to direct their attention, and there's going to be room beyond the label to give them the information they need. But in the short term, that really is a challenge, just dealing with that limited real estate and figuring out what are the important things to communicate to the customer in that moment.
That's really, really interesting. I think it also is like interesting just from a segue, like Elizabeth, there is a specific question for you and around just this idea of what to focus on, I think leads into a big question where there's trade-offs, right? Where you focus on one thing, but what is the impact of that thing on something else that might be something that a consumer is looking for? So specifically the question was around consumer pain points between natural versus product effectiveness, and those perceptions around whether or not natural is as effective. And if there was any kind of insight or kind of previous experience where you've seen something in that notion of that role of the trade-off between a new benefit, but also kind of how that can have an impact on again, efficacy for as an example.
Great question. Thank you to whomever asked that question, because that is at the core of how we're thinking about natural ingredients and clean ingredients, because it is exactly well, Natalie mentioned that consumers have lots of information, and sometimes it's hard to sift through what's true and what's not. And this is a case where there is this preconceived notion that natural isn't as effective, and the efficacy of a product is always tied to the ingredients. And in reality, we're having to kind of disprove that in many cases to say it's not necessarily a trade-off. And there's lots of trade-offs that we have to help consumers navigate, whether it's efficacy versus ingredient or ingredient versus price. Do you have to pay more to get certain things? And so, that's how we've kind of navigated our idea of conscious beauty to try and help, simplify but provide all the information to consumers so that they can make an informed choice. And I think this is one of the real evolutions from a retail standpoint, because in the days of old, it came from the department store area where we've said, stack them high and let them fly. Right? Like we say what you're going to buy and you just come in and you just buy it, right? That's no longer the case here. And so we have to provide consumers options and help them navigate those options, because what's right for one customer walking through the door is not necessarily right for the next customer coming through the door or into the ecosystem, if you will. So I also look forward to the virtual reality or augmented reality of wearing the glasses, because in the world of, cereal or soup that I used to work on, there was a lot of space in the packaging, kind of down to a lipstick or an eyeliner. It's even less packaging space. No, but there's so much to know about the products that you're buying because of that very complex decision process. So absolutely love that question. Thank you for asking. And it's something that we're working through live, and it's a real and true situation for us.
And actually, just speaking on the phygital piece, there was a question about the demographic makeup of the work we did. So just to clarify, we looked at consumers between 18 and 74 across these 13 countries. So that's basically the limitation of the data. But what's interesting to me about this whole phygital thing is this whole emerging focus on accessibility. And I was just curious to hear both of your thoughts on this, because I just went through this moment with my father-in-law, for example, who's both hard of hearing and can't see very well. And I hooked him up with, without naming brands, with the modern cell phone, with a digital assistant, earphones, so he can do some basic orders, basic shopping online. And then recently I help him sort of go through his finances at the end of every month. And I'm recently going through those finances. I'm like, wow, you really went to town shopping this last month. And he was like, yeah, it was the best month ever, because I suddenly felt like I was alive again, because his mobility is restricted. He can't hear well, he can't see well. And suddenly the technology has transformed his experience. And I think what's interesting to me is accessibility isn't just saying, oh, we want a man who's 78 years old to access our products. I think what it's actually saying is it's sending the right message to the 25-year-old who now values this. So I'm just curious to hear both of your thoughts on this. Perhaps we can begin with you, Natalie.
It's a great question. I mentioned earlier being a food and, a retailer in food and beverage and health and beauty, we've got to have something for everybody. We've got to be accessible for everyone. So it's definitely something to be thinking about. I love the idea of sort of that altruism that I think you're seeing in the research you're doing. And that is what it kind of links back to me, that there's just this overall movement of being more altruistic and saying it's my responsibility to take care of myself, but like, how can I also help others and make things more accessible for others, like you're doing with your in-laws. I'm doing the same thing with mine. And you see them using digital assistants and things like that. So it kind of gets back to that individual responsibility and that sense of community that I think we all want to create.
And I would add that, you mentioned it, but consumers really do expect companies and brands and businesses to take action, as they should, right? We're hearing consumers saying, hey, you're a big business. I want you to leverage that bigness to do something. And we're saying, yeah, that's right. You should call us out on that. We should take action. And so, we are, when it comes to beauty, we're talking, the beauty industry has not been kind to everyone. And we acknowledge that and we're recognizing that. And we're now asking ourselves, how can we make a change? Because, as an organization, we have a voice in the beauty industry. We have a voice, and we're the creators of experiences. So just as consumers expect us, we should and must act in a way that provides accessibility from an experience standpoint, but also unlocks the power of beauty for everyone. So I guess I would kind of say we should be doubling down on providing accessible experiences and meaningful products and the right community and dialogue.
Yeah, and I want to build one thing on that too, if I can. When I think about the simplest, quickest, easiest way that I innovate, it's by walking in the store and looking at the shelf and saying, who is being left out right now?
This is so awesome, Natalie, because there's literally a question that I wanted to kind of pose, which was, on one hand, you've got Kroger, which needs to basically kind of service the kind of the large group of people that come in and day out. But at the same time, the question is having such a diverse group of shoppers, how do you choose what to focus on when you're doing line extensions, or how do you satisfy more unique customer palettes when you're basically kind of looking to basically operationally solve the problem, but at the same time maintain that kind of that relevance with more diverse groups of consumers?
It's the easiest and hardest part of my job, because it's something that is so obvious and easy. Like, my team, we're good at what we do. We can easily look at that shelf and say, this is the customer that's being left out right now. But trying to make room on a shelf where there are products that exist that are doing their job and doing it well, those workhorse brands and products. But when you're as big as Kroger, that's the only place growth is going to come from, because we're already meeting the needs of so many people. If we want to maintain, fine, we just keep doing what we're doing for a while. There's risk in that too, right? So helping our internal customers understand the risk of not doing anything and just assuming that these workhorse products are going to continue to do the job they're doing for customers. Our customers are evolving. That's just not true. So it's about articulating that risk of not doing anything, and then helping them understand and accurately predict the size of prize of making room for these other customers. What's difficult for us is, we're organized, and I'm sure a lot of organizations are like this, where, somebody's in charge of one category, one brand, one aisle. My team has to think across the whole store. So chip is going to compete with Doritos is ridiculous. But if we don't have that plant-based item in every part of the store to meet that customer's needs, we're losing an entire basket. Yep. So articulating that story is really important, but it is really difficult because our innovation team does believe that there are important customers who spend a lot of money that are being left out of our stores right now. And finding that room is really, really difficult.
That's great. It's so interesting, right? Like, it's that ability to try and figure out the right pathway to get to the bigger picture. And I loved, kind of one of the things that came out as we were talking about the trends that we saw, which, and Natalie, is what you said, which is consumers keep asking why. And there's this ongoing kind of necessity to not only kind of, understand what and where and when, but to really get to the why. So I think that one of the reasons why I think Ujwal and I were really excited to have this conversation with you was also so that we could talk a little bit about how that actually needs to take place more in innovation and insight, and how, in some ways, if we're not kind of getting to the bigger overarching why when it comes to understanding consumers, understanding kind of the cultural impact of the choices that we make as an organization, but also the impact that culture has on basically guiding the organizational kind of choices that we're making. I'd love to pull that a little bit apart and get both your point of view in regards to the importance of getting to the why when it comes to your role and the function that your teams are serving.
Yeah, I can take a start here. When it comes, I think innovation is a great example. So thank you for bringing that up. And it's often that we kind of have to make the case that innovation, especially in the digital space, like technology for technology's sake, is not the right way to innovate. There should be a reason that we're doing something different. We're not going to go out and try and ask consumers to change their behavior to shop in our way, right? It's really about doing something because there's a consumer pain point or an opportunity. And that's where the why, really digging in on the why can and should spark innovation and drive change going forward.
I love this question. I think if you ask any of my family members, they'll say like the most annoying thing about me as a child was I just was asking why all the time. And somehow I managed to turn that into a career. I'm a total data nerd. It's part of why I really like working with you guys, as I know you are too. We just want to oversimplify everything. And to me, it's about root cause analysis. Like, I want to know the root cause of behavior. Consumers notoriously do not do what they say they're going to do. So we have to know the why, or we're never going to be able to really answer their needs. I think I know one of the best examples of this is pumpkin spice. So many years in my career working in the flavor industry, what's the next pumpkin spice? What's the next pumpkin spice? So in my last employer, we really studied that. And I love looking at distribution of answers, because you can get 50% liking or purchase intent, and that can mean nobody really likes it or hates it, right? Everybody's just kind of on the fence about it. And who wants to launch that product, right? Yep. But 50% can also mean half the customers love it. Yep. Can you guys still hear me? My computer froze.
No, you're good.
So
you're good.
I love bimodal distribution. I want to innovate where 50% loves something, but you will never know that if you just look at the surface, right? So what is it about pumpkin spice that 50% of customers love? You dig into that, you figure it out, but also who's being left out of the conversation and why are they being left out? Is it because they don't like pumpkin? Could be. Is it because they don't have the same links to nostalgia and pumpkin? Maybe that's not a flavor they grew up with. So we're sitting here trying to figure out what's the next pumpkin spice, when really the question is, what's the other half want? That opportunity is right in front of us and being ignored. That's why you've got to just keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper to find those motivations. If you ask pumpkin spice
makes sense. And
the same question today, it still comes back at like 50%. It's this like cultural phenomenon. And there's still like half the people who want nothing to do with it, that are just every fall like, well, what am I going to get? Why doesn't anybody care about me?
That's right. I want warmth and a feeling of hearthness, but I don't like pumpkin, and nobody is solving for me.
Yeah, or it's too cliche. I don't want to be a basic type, right? Like, I'm too cool for pumpkin spice. What's my product?
And actually, this is sort of related to the point both of you are discussing right now, which is, one of the big questions we often get is, and we see this a lot in the industry. I mean, both of you are strategic thinkers. You are asking questions. You are pushing your teams to ask the right kind of questions and not take things for granted. But this is obviously, as you all know, this is not the case everywhere. There's still a long journey for the research industry, for the innovation industry to travel in order to make that a common practice. And I'll give you one example. If we take one of our first shifts from following rules to living with instinct. The most common question we might get is, okay, I get it. People are tired of following rules. They want to live more instinctually. But how does that specifically apply to the work I do? How do I make it apply to the work I do? And what I wanted to do was two things. One is I wanted to throw out a couple of examples of how that could apply specifically to people's work. But perhaps more importantly, I wanted both of your perspective on this, because I know you deal with this in your day-to-day work all the time. Elizabeth, I heard a little bit of that in your talk when you talked about bringing culture in to the insights process, right? Because your culture is big issues that are shifting, and we are so often taught to think in terms of tactics. What is the next thing I should do? Can you just tell me what the ingredient is? Can you just tell me what the specific trend is so I can just do it? And so how do you bridge that gap? So I wanted to give you a couple of examples and just kind of hopefully spark some ideas in your mind as well. So from rules to instincts, what are some specific questions we can ask, category agnostic, that impacts our businesses? How is the definition or meaning of pure changing in our industry? What is the future of a pure ingredient? That's an example of something very tangible that actually translates from this shift. Another example is, how is self-care itself changing in the context of my category or the work I do? What does that even mean today? If everybody's trying to follow their instinct, how does that translate into what self-care means? So I just wanted to throw out a couple of examples because oftentimes we get asked, how do we actually draw the linkage between the big hairy thing and the very tangible thing? So I just wanted to get a couple of your thoughts on this, and then, if you could talk a little bit about how you managed to do that, or, perhaps it's an ongoing thing that is a continued source of development, but really curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I love this question. And you're right. We are trying to think about this intersection of where beauty and culture meet, right? Because we are not living in a vacuum over here. Beauty is part of culture, and we want to be culture shapers. And so, we have to understand where those two massive elements kind of intersect. Sometimes I say collide, but it's more like an intersect, not a collision. And so as we do that, we know that we have a role to play. And when it comes to, you mentioned self-care, and I'll go there as an example. Self-care, I think, is something that we've allowed ourselves to do. And it's got so many wonderful connections to beauty in routines and products. But the pandemic really did allow us to say it's okay to take time for self-care. And that self-care has now been really connected to wellness. And we know that 2/3 of consumers are making a strong connection between wellness and beauty. So these kind of big cultural shifts are absolutely relevant every day in every way. And so the products we offer, the ingredients that are inside of those products, how we bring them to life in the store, how we talk about them, and how we help our consumers empower their own wellness when using them. So there's absolutely this connection. And I think that part of how do we do that? I want to say we've always been taught to ask the right questions. And, I think that, yes, it's important. We should be asking the right questions in all sorts of ways. But I think it's even more important now that we teach ourselves to listen, and that we have to move from an ask to a listen, because, consumers are people. I don't want to get crazy, but they're humans, right? And they don't always make logical choices. If we ask a question, we'll get an answer, right? But we have to think about what are we asking and how are we listening to what that answer is, so that we can really understand that why and take the action that's specific to our product and our brand, but also relevant in this broad look at culture. Because as we kind of push our businesses forward, I'm not here to be interesting, right? I'm here to have an impact. And listening is really about moving forward. Asking is about where have we been and how did we get here? And I use this analogy, like if we're all driving a car, it's important that we have a rearview mirror, because we need to know where we've come from and how we got here and where we are. But if we're in that car, our rearview mirror is about this big, but our windshield is this big, right? We have to look through the windshield and we have to see what's coming. And in order to do that, we have to listen to consumers and understand the whys and really look forward to how they're making their choices.
Yeah.
I keep thinking a lot about trust and how you build trust with your customers, and how you build trust as an innovation group within your own company. And trust is really about competence and character, right? And you can't get people to trust your character unless you are authentic and transparent. So within the workplace, one of the ways that I do this is right off the bat, I often, and this was an idea from Adam Grant, I won't take credit for it, saying why it's not going to work right from the beginning. Like, I make the recommendation of what I think the trend is or what I think we should do. And here's all the things I've already thought about that you're going to say on why this won't work. Like, just get it out there. Yeah. And I do think that helps build trust in the ideas that I have. Strategy is such a great businessy word, and innovation feels so fluffy sometimes, but it's all predicting futures. It's all the same thing, in my opinion. Yeah. And I just wonder too, could brands do more of that same kind of thing? And would that give customers that ownership in the process to say, this isn't just who the product is for, but this is who it's not for. Yeah. Like, if you're this person, this isn't the product for you. Could that help build trust? Could we do a better job of letting customers know, like, we don't want this person to pick up this product? Yeah. I think too, when I think about self-care, I think a lot about food as medicine. That's a really important pillar of growth for Kroger. Our Kroger health team, we're one of the biggest pharmacies in the country. We've got a great team of dietitians. My team's working closer and closer with that organization. And self-care, and I think about in our responsibility for that as a retailer of food and beverage, we do have to have those obvious short-term wins, follow those close-in trends. But I think about what we know as experts, where it's not just this specific little one functional need. It's also about, like, we need to make the country healthier by reducing sugar, reducing salt. Like, are there ways we can do that where the customer doesn't even have to ask for it, where we start behind the scenes changing our products and building that long-term innovation plan where in 10 years we can say, you guys didn't even notice this, but we've reduced the sugar and salt and fat in our products slowly over time. We know this works, but that's hard to do. So what are customers asking for that you need to do to have those short-term wins in care and making them feel like better versions of themselves? But also, what do we know as experts in our field, whether that's beauty, food, beverage, medicine, to say, we know that these are the things that are really going to have an impact. And behind the scenes, we're going to start being responsible for these things for you, whether or not we get the credit for it on day one or in 10 years. It's the right thing to do, and it's going to grow our business.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just, related to a couple of the points you both made, I think what's interesting for us also is this realization that, we may not always realize it in the moment, but everything is connected to everything else. It's sort of this semi-funny example, but you might say, hey, this shift towards self-care, how does that connect to a toilet cleaner? Turns out it does connect to a toilet cleaner, because in the past, we would have to apply this blue liquid and scrub. Now you get these new toilet cleaners where you apply it self-cleans, self-dissolves, and disappears away. And sometimes I use this example, as silly as it might be, to illustrate the point that sometimes we see words like these or shifts like these, and we dismiss them, and we think, I work on chewing gum, I work on pens. How is that relevant to me? But I think the point you're making is that you have to be comfortable in creating an open environment to actually exploring that relationship, because everything connects to everything else. There is going to be a relationship, and when you figure that out, it will result in a huge aha that will create the opportunity naturally, right? And I guess build a better, sort of creative lens with which we can do our work.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice tie back to what you had mentioned earlier about, being healthy and happy is linked to your physical body, as, your emotional state is connected to your physical body. Like, it is all connected, and we have to understand, all of that, because our consumers aren't living in a vacuum. They don't wake up in the morning and say, what kind of mascara should I purchase today, right? We're connected into their full lives, and we need to understand consumers as humans and holistic humans.
I love that point, and I think that it's such an important one to take into consideration. I think one of the challenges that we have to overcome sometimes is helping organizations and helping teams really kind of take that step back and walk in the shoes of the consumer, both to basically empathize with the different types of paths that different types of consumers are taking, but also to basically kind of we sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees. One of my favorite examples is we got briefed on how are we going to help consumers engage more with shelf-stable foods. And we were like, no consumer knows what a shelf-stable foods is. You're talking about canned food, and that's okay. It's okay, but let's take a step back here for a second. Let's ask ourselves why you framed it with such an operational lens. Now talk to us about what type of consumer do you think is the one that should be engaging with your brand? Did you know that there's this type of consumer? Did you know that this empathetically is why emotionally they're more likely to engage with things? And it became this series of steps in order to zoom out, to go back to that kind of that broader purview of what was shaping experience, what was shaping expectation, And meanwhile, that split-second decision when they're standing in the aisle was basically kind of laddered back to all these previous touch points that were completely being ignored. But once we went through that process, all of a sudden it opened up all these areas of opportunity, right? And I think that that's really kind of an exciting thing to take into consideration when teams are reviewing this deck is that when I look at these key shifts, we're literally 100,000 feet up in the air looking down at the planet, and these are movements. It's like watching birds in the sky, and they're all starting to fly in the same direction. Now, different birds are going to land on different trees, and some of those trees are going to be our retail locations, they're going to be our websites, they're going to be the places that we want to basically lure those birds so that we can engage with them and build those lasting relationships with them. But if we don't understand the pattern at that 100-foot level, then we don't have that full purview or that whole picture. And I think that that's the exciting kind of part of what we get to do on a day-to-day basis, both as innovation and insight professionals and researchers, is to basically go into the gory details of the nuance, but then invest the time and the effort to ladder back to these bigger overarching shifts, because the more we can find those connection points, the more we can really start to make an impact for an organization, because we're ahead of the curve. We're one step ahead of kind of where a market's going or where the consumer wants to be. And, Natalie, I love that example of basically kind of thinking about, long-term changes that are going to meet the consumer where they're going to end up. Because at the end of the day, that's how you really drive long-term change and build that authenticity and trust with consumers.
So I know we're almost at time. What I wanted to do was just do a quick summary of some of the key points that both of you also brought up here. And then please do feel free to jump in and add anything else that I might have missed or you'd like the audience to take away. I think first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us. This was really fantastic to have your perspective on this. There were a bunch of themes that really stood out to me. I think two themes in particular, we on one hand, we talked about clearly we're seeing this pattern of the consumer just wanting to feel more and more empowered. And our job becomes to empower their decisions in the right way and to understand, what is the level of information detail and knowledge they're looking to build. That really stood out to me. Another one that stood out to me, and which is related, is this whole idea of, I think we have to get comfortable with the idea that the consumer is getting smarter by the minute, asking the why by the minute. And we have to figure out how we're going to fit into that evolving world. And I think perhaps the distinction we have to make is that the human being, when they make the decision, believes that they're being as smart as they possibly can. Whether they're technically right or wrong is immaterial. The point is they believe they're doing the right thing for themselves in that moment. And that's the challenge we all have to navigate as we continue. Another thing that stood out to me was, obviously, we talked a little bit about the evolving nature of human relationships, the phygital environment we all live in. And we also talked about, obviously what that means in terms of the types of experiences we build for consumers. And then the last thing I think that was also really interesting is we just talked about, so I think sort of the broader movement towards the collective redefining, what does success mean for me? How do I refocus my energies as a human being on the smaller things, the smaller joys of life? And I think that actually opens the door to some really interesting opportunities in a lot of different industries that may have traditionally not thought of themselves a certain way. For example, the redefinition of what the consumer considers luxury, redefinition of what is considered self-care, all of this stuff. So those were sort of the four key buckets that I drew out in my really bad handwriting on my notebook. Anything else that I might have missed, or any other parting words from both of you?
That was a great summary. Thank you. It has been both eye-opening and a joy to be part of the dialogue today. And I look forward to, read the report, listen to it, and go back and read it again and figure out how we're going to, apply this as we look through that windshield going forward for our organization. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I think that this is one of the most interesting times to be in an insights and innovation type role. I think the kind of people and minds that work in those spaces have never been more needed in their organization. So I feel really empowered by the unpredictability of everything that we're talking about with the future, and being a part of this just kind of overall reset for customers, for consumers. And I totally agree with you, Ujwal. I think this is a time for companies to sort of decide how they want to be a part of it and help build that future alongside their customers.
Yep.
Wonderful. And I do know, I will acknowledge there were some questions about methodology. I apologize. We deliberately didn't want to get to them. We didn't want to digress from the focus of the conversation. So we have all of your questions. We will make sure we send a note back to everybody, just address questions about methodology, what countries were included in the analysis, and all of that. So I promise you will hear from us by email on that. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you for our esteemed guests. For your time. I know it was a fair bit of investment, especially end of year. I know how busy things can be, so really, really appreciate it. Thank you so very much. And Jason, I don't need to thank you. We are attached to the hip as always.
You take me for granted all the time.
Always a pleasure to do these sessions with you.
I will just say that Too Cool for Pumpkin Spice is definitely a cool band name that I will be stealing and taking away from this conversation. Perfect. I took a lot away from the conversation, but I also took that away from it as well. So.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.